get your hands where I can see them, and don't you dare move until I tell you to." The voice came from the darkness outside the driver's side window, thick with a contempt that had nothing to do with traffic law and everything to do with assumption, and the woman sitting behind the wheel of the black Mercedes S-Class heard it the way she had learned to hear every threat in her life, not with fear, but with the cold, precise clarity of someone who has spent decades calculating the exact weight of danger before deciding how to respond. Her name was General Ada Caldwell, though the man standing outside that window in the cold Virginia rain had absolutely no idea who she was, and that ignorance, that spectacular, catastrophic ignorance, was about to become the single most consequential mistake of his professional life. It was 11:47 at night in Arlington, Virginia, and the rain had been falling since sunset, turning the quiet residential streets into long ribbons of black mirror that reflected the amber glow of streetlights in shivering pools across the asphalt. And Ada had been driving through those streets in silence. The only sounds in the car, the low hum of the engine, and the rhythmic sweep of the wipers across the windshield, which she found almost meditative after the kind of day she had just survived inside the Pentagon's deepest briefing rooms. She was exhausted in the way that only people who carry genuinely enormous weight can be exhausted. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that settles into your bones after hours of staring at satellite imagery of naval formations in the South China Sea, after briefing 3-star generals on force readiness projections, after sitting in a subterranean secure conference room until nearly 11 o'clock, managing a situation that most Americans would never know existed, and doing all of that while being one of fewer than a handful of black women in a building full of people who had at various points in her career questioned whether she belonged there at all. She was out of uniform tonight, wearing a tailored charcoal civilian pantsuit that she had changed into before leaving the building, the jacket tossed onto the passenger seat beside her brown leather briefcase, which was locked with a combination she had memorized 14 years ago and changed every 90 days without fail, and which contained classified briefing documents marked TS/SCI, top secret sensitive compartmented information that she was scheduled to present to General Roland T. Graves, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in a 5 o'clock briefing that was now less than 5 hours away. She had been thinking about nothing in particular as she drove, letting her mind go deliberately quiet for the first time all day when the red and blue lights erupted in her rearview mirror, slicing through the rain with the particular violence of lights that are designed not just to signal, but to intimidate. And she felt the familiar weight of what those lights meant settle across her shoulders like something she had been carrying her whole life. She knew the statistics the way she knew operational data precisely without flinching, because flinching was a luxury she had never been able to afford, and because knowing the numbers had always been the first step toward surviving them. She pulled smoothly into the well-lit parking lot of a gas station about 40 yards ahead, shifted the car into park, turned on the interior dome light so that everything inside the vehicle would be clearly visible to anyone approaching, rolled down her window and placed both hands flat on the top of the steering wheel. Fingers spread because this was not a night to give anyone a reason to escalate, and because she had been here before in different cars in different cities, and she understood with absolute clarity that her survival in the next few minutes depended entirely on her remaining calmer than the man walking toward her. Officer Brett Landers had been on the Arlington County Police Department for 11 years, and in all that time, across all the shifts and all the stops and all the paperwork and all the disciplinary hearings that his union representative had quietly made disappear, he had never once genuinely believed that the badge on his chest was a tool of service rather than a symbol of dominance, and that belief, or rather that fundamental misunderstanding of what a badge was actually for, had shaped every single interaction he had ever had with the public in ways that were subtle enough to survive the administrative review process, but corrosive enough to have left a trail of 9 civilian complaints stretching back across his entire career. He had platinum blonde hair cut so short it looked almost white under fluorescent light, pale blue eyes that had long since hardened from whatever softness they might once have contained into something flat and appraising. The kind of eyes that sorted people quickly into categories, and rarely revisited the sorting once it was done. And he carried himself with the particular physical confidence of a man who had been told by his department, by his union, by the quiet machinery of institutional protection, that his judgment was always defensible, and his actions were always justifiable no matter what the people on the other end of those actions might say about it. 9 complaints in 11 years, and not one of them had cost him anything more significant than a formal letter placed in a file that nobody outside that building would ever read because that was the arrangement, and Landers had understood the arrangement since his first year on the job, when a senior officer had explained to him with the casual matter-of-factness of someone describing a parking policy that the union existed specifically to ensure that people like him could do their jobs without the constant threat of consequence from people who didn't understand what the job actually required. He had been running routine patrols on the quiet residential streets of North Arlington when the black Mercedes appeared in his peripheral vision, moving at a perfectly legal speed in the correct lane, and his eyes had tracked it the way his eyes always tracked certain things, not because of the car exactly, but because of the glimpse he caught through the streetlight glare of the person behind the wheel, and because in Landers' deeply calcified internal logic, that combination of factors did not compute in the way he felt it should, and a thing that didn't compute was by his reasoning, a thing worth investigating. He ran the plates out of habit more than genuine suspicion, and they came back clean. The vehicle registered to one Ada Caldwell. No warrants, no flags, nothing actionable but clean plates had never stopped Landers before, when he had already made up his mind that something was worth pursuing. And so he followed her, keeping a steady distance, watching her tires, watching her speed, waiting with the practiced patience of someone who had done this particular kind of waiting many times before, and who knew from long experience that if you followed someone long enough with your eyes fixed on them looking for a reason, you would eventually find one. The right front tire of the Mercedes drifted perhaps 3 inches across the faded white shoulder line as Ada navigated a gentle curve, not a swerve, not a lane departure, not anything that a reasonable observer would classify as erratic driving, but a microscopic deviation that lasted less than a second before the car smoothly corrected itself and continued forward in perfect alignment, and that was enough because Landers had been waiting for exactly that kind of enough, and he hit the lights. Inside the gas station that Ada had chosen as her stopping point, well-lit, visible public, the way every piece of safety advice for black drivers in America told you to do. A silver minivan sat at the far pump with its engine running, and in the back seat pressed against the window with a hardcover picture book. Balanced on his knees sat a boy of about 9 years old named Tobias, who had been waiting for his father to finish paying inside the station while he looked at a page in his book depicting a black soldier standing at attention in full dress uniform beneath the words, "The bravest among us." Tobias looked up from the book because the red and blue lights in the Mercedes's mirror reflected across the wet pavement of the parking lot and caught his attention, and he watched through the rain-streaked glass as the woman in the black car turned on her interior light, placed her hands on the steering wheel and sat very still, in the way that people sit when they are trying very hard to make themselves as unthreatening as possible, which even at 9 years old Tobias somehow understood was not the same as being unafraid. He watched the officer approach the car, and he watched the flashlight beam hit the woman's face through the open window. And he watched her hold herself perfectly still while the light blinded her. And something about the stillness of her, the deliberate, controlled, dignified stillness caught in his chest in a way he didn't have words for yet, and he pressed the book a little tighter against his knees and kept watching without blinking. The way children watch things they instinctively know are important, as if looking away might somehow make it worse for the person they're watching. His father came back to the van 2 minutes later, tossed a bottle of water onto the passenger seat, glanced toward the Mercedes and the police cruiser with its light still going, and without a word reached over and gently pulled his son back from the window and buckled his seatbelt. And when Tobias asked his father what the woman had done wrong, his father was quiet for a long moment before he started the engine, and that silence told Tobias more than any answer could have. Landers approached the Mercedes with his flashlight already up at face level before he had even cleared the rear bumper. The beam angled not to illuminate the interior of the vehicle, but to shine directly into the driver's eyes, which was a technique that had less to do with officer safety and everything to do with establishing, from the very first second, who was in control of this interaction, and Ada received the light without flinching, without raising her hand to shield her eyes, without doing anything that could be interpreted as resistance or impatience, because she had already decided exactly how this was going to go, and that decision had nothing to do with how she felt, and everything to do with what she knew. "Good evening, officer," she said, her voice carrying the same level, unhurried cadence she used when she was briefing three-star generals on force disposition maps, a voice that was calibrated not to placate but to communicate clearly in high-stakes environments, and she watched his face in the peripheral light thrown back from the flashlight beam and saw nothing in it that surprised her. She informed him before each movement her license was in her purse on the passenger seat. Her registration was in the glove compartment. How would he like her to proceed? And his response was to lean closer to the window and tell her to just get the documents, his tone carrying the particular brand of impatience that is really a form of contempt. Wearing the costume of professionalism, and Ada retrieved her wallet from her purse with slow, deliberate hands and drew out both her Virginia driver's license and her Department of Defense Common Access card, which listed her name, her branch of service, and her rank. General O-10 United States Army in clear text beneath a holographic federal seal that would have been unmistakable to anyone who was actually looking. Landers took both cards from her hand, held the flashlight on the driver's license, and spoke her name aloud in the tone of someone reading something mildly suspicious off a boarding pass, his eyes moving from the license to her face in the way people look at someone when they've already decided the story doesn't add up, and they're just waiting to prove it. And when he got to the DOD card, he barely glanced at it before setting it down on his palm beside the license and asking her in a voice thick with the kind of casual, weaponized condescension that is meant to diminish without ever technically crossing the line of professional conduct, whose car this was and where she was coming from at this hour. She told him the vehicle was hers, as the registration would confirm, and she was coming from work at the Pentagon, and she had not been drinking. And would he please look at the second card she had given him, the one with the federal seal? And she said this last part not as a request, but in the register she used when she expected to be obeyed. Landers asked her if she cleaned the cafeterias there. The sentence hung in the cold air between them for a moment, and Ada felt the familiar sensation of something she had spent 30 years learning to absorb without letting it reach the part of her that could be broken. Not because it didn't land, not because it wasn't precisely as ugly as it was, but because she had made a decision long ago that men like this one would never get to see what their words actually cost her, because the moment they saw that they would have won something she was not willing to give them. She told him, her voice dropping one deliberate register to the tone she used when she was correcting a subordinate officer who had made a consequential error in judgment, that she was asking him to look at the second identification card she had provided, to note the rank printed on that card, and to verify her identity through his department's access to federal databases before he proceeded any further, because she wanted to give him every possible opportunity to walk back from the edge of the professional cliff he was standing on. Landers held the CAC card up in the flashlight beam, squinted at it with performative skepticism, and informed her that she could buy one of these online for $50 and that he'd seen better fakes. And as he said it, his voice had the quality of a man who had rehearsed this kind of dismissal so many times that it had become reflexive rather than considered a habit of disbelief directed at anyone who challenged the hierarchy he had constructed in his own mind. And Ada watched him in the way a very good chess player watches an opponent who has just moved their queen into a position from which there is no recovery. She requested again clearly and formally that he verify her credentials through federal channels, and she said the word formally with the kind of weight that made it clear she was documenting this moment in the part of her memory reserved for things that would later be relevant in official proceedings. And Landers' response to being instructed by someone he had already categorized as beneath him was the response she had anticipated. His face flushed, his jaw tightened, and he told her to step out of the vehicle. She asked, still in the same controlled voice, whether she was under arrest, and if so, on what charge. He told her to get out of the car. She told him her hands were on the steering wheel and asked him again whether she was being placed under arrest. And then, Lander's 11 years of unchallenged authority, rushing up through his nervous system like electricity through a wire, reached through the open window, grabbed the door handle, and pulled it open. What happened next took approximately 45 seconds, and every one of those seconds was captured in high-definition clarity by the dashboard camera mounted on the inside of Landers's windshield, whose red recording light had been blinking steadily since the moment he had hit his sirens. Though Landers had long since stopped thinking about cameras the way a man who has always been protected stops thinking about consequences as something theoretical that happens to other people. He reached across her to unbuckle her seatbelt, grabbed her by the lapel of her charcoal jacket and pulled her out of the driver's seat with a force that had nothing to do with necessity, and everything to do with the particular rage of a man who cannot tolerate being told no by someone he has decided should not be capable of telling him anything at all. And Ada stumbled once as her feet found the wet asphalt, but caught her balance immediately, her body straightening to its full height with the automatic precision of someone whose posture has been military grade for more than 3 decades. She did not fight back, not because she was incapable of it, but because she understood with absolute tactical clarity that fighting back was a losing move in this particular engagement, and that the real fight was not going to happen on the shoulder of this road in the rain, but somewhere else entirely under conditions that would be far more favorable to her, and far more devastating to him. And she stood with her back straight and her chin level and her eyes fixed on the camera light blinking red through his windshield as he spun her around and slammed her chest against the cold metal side of the Mercedes. The handcuffs went on with unnecessary force, ratcheted down tighter than protocol required, biting into the skin of her wrists in a way that left marks she noted mentally with the same detached precision she brought to assessing battlefield damage. And Landers recited charges driving under the influence, resisting a lawful order, possession of fraudulent federal identification as he marched her toward the cruiser, and Ada walked with her head up and her eyes forward, and gave him nothing. Not a stumble, not a sound, not a single thing he could point to later as evidence that he had gotten to her. Landers grabbed her purse and her leather briefcase from the passenger seat of the Mercedes and tossed them both onto the front seat of his cruiser without examining them, without noting the combination lock on the briefcase, without stopping to consider, for even a single second, what might be inside a locked leather case belonging to a woman who had told him she worked at the Pentagon, and Ada watched him do it from the back of the cruiser and thought about the TS/SCI document sitting 18 inches from his coffee cup, and she closed her eyes for exactly one breath, not to calm herself, but to begin constructing the precise sequence of what was going to happen next. At the gas station pump behind them, Tobias had turned in his seatbelt to watch through the rear window as the woman was put into the police car, and he stayed twisted in that position, watching the cruiser pull out of the parking lot and into the rain until the taillights disappeared around the curve and there was nothing left to see, and he turned back around and sat very still with his picture book in his lap and said nothing for the entire drive home. Though his father could see in the rearview mirror that his son's eyes were open and that he was thinking in the heavy, serious way that children think when they have witnessed something they know they will carry with them for a very long time. The Arlington County Police Department's main precinct was the kind of building that had been designed to project institutional authority and had succeeded mostly in projecting institutional fatigue, its fluorescent-lit interior smelling of burnt coffee and printer toner, and the particular staleness of a space where too many people have spent too many long hours doing too many things that weighed on them. And when Landers pushed through the heavy double doors with Ada ahead of him, the officers working the graveyard shift looked up with the mild interest of people who have seen a great many things come through those doors and have long since stopped being surprised by most of them. Landers was already talking before he reached the booking desk, narrating his catch for anyone within earshot with the enthusiasm of someone who believes they have done something impressive. DU. I resisting fraudulent D. ODID. and the car was probably stolen too. He was having it impounded, and a couple of officers leaned back in their chairs to look at Ada with expressions ranging from idle curiosity to something less comfortable, something that flickered briefly in the eyes of the ones who had enough experience to notice that the woman Landers was describing and the woman standing in front of them were not quite the same person. Desk Sergeant Dale Hoffman had been behind that booking counter for 22 years, and in those 22 years he had developed the particular instinct of someone who has processed enough human beings in enough different states to recognize almost without thinking about it when something is deeply wrong with the story he is being told. And the something that was wrong tonight announced itself to him the moment he looked over the counter at the woman Landers had brought in, not because she looked drunk, which she did not because she looked like a car thief, which she also did not, but because of the quality of her stillness, the kind of absolute controlled composure that does not belong to someone who is frightened or guilty, but to someone who is waiting with great patience and great precision for exactly the right moment. He told Landers to take the cuffs off, and when Landers argued that she had been resisting, Hoffman repeated the order in the flat, unhurried tone of a man who does not need to raise his voice to communicate that this is not a discussion. And Landers scowled and complied, yanking the cuffs off with more force than necessary. And Ada brought her hands forward and looked at the marks on her wrists with an expression that was not pain and was not anger, but was something more like careful observation. The way a doctor looks at a symptom they are cataloging rather than experiencing. In the far corner of the room, seated at a desk, half hidden behind a monitor that was currently displaying an incident report he had been filling out for the past 40 minutes. Officer Darnell Reyes was 28 years old and 7 months into his career with the Arlington County Police Department, and he had laughed at Landers' narration when they came through the door. Not a real laugh. More, the automatic social reflex of someone who has not yet fully understood that he has a choice about what he participates in. And now he sat very still behind his monitor with his hands resting on the keyboard, and his eyes tracking between Landers and the woman at the booking desk with an expression that was doing something complicated and quiet in the muscles around his mouth. Ada turned to face the room and spoke her name and rank, and the nature of her complaint in a voice that was not loud, but that had the quality of sound in a church, the kind of voice that the space itself seems to carry further than physics should allow, and the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet. When something has shifted fundamentally, and everyone present can feel it but no one yet knows what it means. Hoffman pushed the heavy black desk phone across the counter without being asked twice, and Ada looked at it for a moment and then picked up the receiver and dialed from memory a number that most people in that building had never heard of and would not have recognized, a restricted 202 area code that bypassed the Pentagon's main switchboard entirely and connected directly to the National Military Command Center, the secure nerve center through which the most senior military leadership of the United States maintained continuous operational awareness of threats to national security 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The line was answered on the first ring by a duty officer whose voice carried the alert, clipped professionalism of someone who lives at permanent readiness, and Ada gave her name and her authorization code with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to every official communication. And there was a brief pause as the code was verified against a federal database, and then the duty officer confirmed authentication and asked how the command center could assist the general this evening. Ada asked to be connected to General Roland T. Graves on his secure mobile. Behind the booking counter, Landers had been narrating this performance for the benefit of 2 officers nearby, suggesting with great confidence and evident amusement that she was probably calling her drug dealer, and a couple of people had smiled, and then the smiles had faded, and now the room was doing the specific kind of listening that people do when they are pretending not to listen, but are in fact listening very hard, and Reyes had stopped pretending to work on his incident report entirely, and was sitting with his hands still on the keyboard, and his eyes on Ada and the phone in her hand. The line connected, and a voice came through the receiver that was deep and unhurried, and carried the absolute authority of a man who had spent decades being the most important person in every room he entered, and Ada said, "Roland?" "It's Ada. The Pacific is quiet. The escalation tonight is in Arlington, Virginia." And then she told him in brief, factual sentences that contained nothing superfluous and omitted nothing relevant that she had been pulled over. Pulled from her vehicle, handcuffed and arrested by a local patrol officer who had declined to verify her federal identification, and that her briefcase containing TS/SCI materials had been confiscated and was currently sitting unsecured on the front seat of that officer's patrol vehicle. The silence on the line lasted 3 seconds, and when Graves spoke again, his voice had the quality of air pressure dropping before a very large storm. Not loud, not angry in any way that was overt, but containing something that made every person in that precinct who was listening, and by now that was everyone, go very still. Hoffman was sweating visibly. He had picked up the CAC card from the desk where Landers had left it, and was turning it over in his hands, looking at the holographic DoD seal, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man rapidly reassessing every decision that had been made in the last 40 minutes, and finding the reassessment deeply, deeply troubling. Landers was still smiling, but the smile had the frozen quality of something that the muscles are maintaining out of habit, while the brain has gone somewhere else entirely. Reyes stood up from his desk, walked to the break room, filled a plastic cup with water from the tap, came back to the booking area, and set it quietly on the counter in front of Ada without saying a word, and without meeting her eyes, and then stepped back to his desk and sat down. And it was perhaps the smallest thing that happened in that precinct that night, and also in its way the most significant. Ada told Hoffman, as she set the receiver back in its cradle, that military police from the joint base would arrive in approximately 11 minutes, and that she would suggest he use those 11 minutes to contact his chief of police, and she said it without drama, without satisfaction, the way a person who has been through a great many difficult things states the next practical fact, and Hoffman was already moving toward his terminal before she had finished the sentence. He pulled up the NCIC federal database with hands that were not entirely steady, typed in the DoD identification number from the card he was holding, and hit enter, and the screen processed the query for perhaps 4 seconds, and then it populated. The photograph that appeared was Ada in full Class A dress uniform, 4 heavy silver stars on each shoulder board, her chest covered in rows of service ribbons that represented 30 years of deployments and commendations and distinguished service in theaters of operation that most people in that room would only ever read about, and beneath the photograph in clean federal database font, Caldwell Adize M. General O. 10 United States Army, Deputy Chief of Staff G3, Clearance TS/SCI. Hoffman turned the monitor slowly to face Landers, and the sound Landers made was not a word. It was the sound of a man stepping onto ground he believed was solid and finding nothing beneath his foot. A brief involuntary exhalation followed by absolute silence. And the color drained from his face in the way that color drains from something that has lost its structural support, and he looked from the screen to Ada, and then back to the screen, and then to Hoffman looking for some exit, some alternate reading of what he was seeing, and found none. Reyes across the room looked at the monitor from his desk, and then looked at Ada, and then looked at the cup of water he had placed on the counter, and felt something settle in his chest that was not quite guilt, and not quite grief, but was something in the territory of both a reckoning that was quiet and private, and that nobody else in the room would have noticed, but that he would carry with him for a very long time after that night. The double doors of the precinct burst open 11 minutes later, exactly as promised, and the sound of combat boots on linoleum filled the room like a pronouncement. There were no sirens, no announcement, no theatrical build-up, just the synchronized percussion of 4 pairs of heavy military boots crossing the threshold in perfect unison, and the officers of the Arlington County Police Department's graveyard shift, who had seen a great many things come through those doors over the years, instinctively pushed back from their desks and stood up without being asked. because there is something in the human nervous system that responds to that particular sound and that particular posture in a way that bypasses conscious decision-making entirely. The 4 military police officers who entered were from the elite unit at Joint Base Meyer-Henderson Hall, and they were wearing full tactical gear with Kevlar vests and carrying themselves with the specific kind of purposeful composure that distinguishes people who are trained to operate under genuine pressure from people who merely believe they are. And behind them came Colonel Patricia Webb Provost Marshall, a woman of about 50 with iron gray hair and an expression that communicated without ambiguity or decoration that she had been woken from sleep for a reason that she found personally offensive and professionally inexcusable, and that someone in this building was going to answer for it. Colonel Webb's salute to Ada was precise, correct, and delivered with the kind of respect that is not performed but is simply the natural expression of one senior military professional acknowledging another, and Ada returned it with equal precision. And the exchange lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but contained within it a complete recalibration of every power dynamic in that room, and several of the local officers who witnessed it seemed to become physically smaller without actually moving. Webb turned to Landers, who was standing slightly apart from his colleagues, now in the way that people become physically isolated when the group they belong to begins to quietly separate itself from them, and asked for the keys to his patrol vehicle so that she could retrieve the general's property. And Landers reached for his belt and could not find the keys, and checked his other side and then his jacket pocket, and finally located the ring of keys, which he fumbled badly enough that they fell to the floor with a loud, flat clatter that seemed in the dead silence of that room to last much longer than it actually did. He picked them up and held them out to the nearest MP, who took them without comment and walked out the door, and Landers was left standing with his empty hand still slightly extended, and he lowered it slowly to his side and looked at the floor. If you have ever watched someone's entire professional identity collapse in real time, not dramatically, not with shouting, but with the quiet, irreversible logic of a structure that has been undermined from beneath, then you understand exactly what was happening in that precinct at this moment. General Ada Caldwell had made one phone call, and in 11 minutes, the architecture of Brett Landers's world had come apart at every seam simultaneously. What happens when the chief of police walks through those doors? What happens when the full weight of what Landers has done lands on the man responsible for this department? Stay with our channel, because the accountability that follows is unlike anything you've ever seen. Chief Vincent Holloway came through the precinct doors at 12:41 in the morning wearing a raincoat that had been thrown over a dress shirt that was not entirely tucked in his hair, showing the imprint of a pillow on one side, moving with the forward-leaning urgency of a man who had received a phone call that had removed all possibility of sleep for the foreseeable future, and who was still processing as he crossed the parking lot and pushed through the glass doors the full sequence of what the governor's chief of staff had told him, which was that the Secretary of Defense had personally contacted the governor of Virginia, which meant that the governor had personally contacted him, which meant that whatever had happened in his department tonight had already traveled up through levels of government that a local police chief does not generally expect to be personally implicated in. He took in the room in one long sweep, the military police in tactical gear, the colonel standing beside a woman he did not recognize but whose bearing told him everything he needed to know, the cluster of his own officers standing back with the careful neutrality of people who have decided not to be associated with whatever this is, Hoffman behind the desk, looking like a man who has aged 5 years in the past hour, and Landers standing slightly apart from everyone alone in the way that people are alone, when the group they relied on for protection has quietly stepped away, and he understood with the thoroughness of a man who had been in this job long enough to recognize an institutional catastrophe when he was standing in the middle of one exactly what had happened here and exactly how bad it was. Ada did not wait for introductions, and she did not offer him the comfort of preamble. She told him standing straight that she required him to pull Officer Landers' personnel file and explain to her in writing how a man with 9 civilian complaints across 11 years had been permitted to continue carrying a badge and a firearm on the streets of his city. And she said it not as an accusation but as an administrative question, the kind of question asked by people who already know the answer and are establishing it on the record. Holloway looked at Landers just once briefly with an expression that contained many things, none of them good for Landers, and then told him to come to his office. The office had glass walls, and the blinds were not closed, and everyone in the squad room could watch in full view what happened next, which was not a conversation between 2 colleagues trying to manage a difficult situation, but an accounting conducted by a man who had survived 30 years in this profession, by understanding precisely when something was too far gone to manage, and when the only option left was to cut it completely away before it took everything else down with it. Holloway came out of the glass office 6 minutes later carrying a plastic evidence bag containing a service weapon and a shield, and the room watched him cross the floor to the booking area in silence. And he set the bag on the counter and read the termination order aloud in a voice that was controlled and deliberate, and designed to be heard clearly by everyone present, because he understood that there was a right way and a wrong way to do what needed to be done here, and that doing it publicly and without hesitation was the only version of this that preserved anything at all. Brett Landers was placed under arrest by 2 of his former colleagues, men who had worked shifts alongside him, who had eaten lunch with him in the break room, who had filed paperwork next to him for years, and they handled him with the professional efficiency of people who are performing an action they find distasteful but necessary, and they did not meet his eyes, and he did not ask them to. The handcuffs went on with a click that was identical in pitch and quality to the click of the handcuffs he had put on Ada less than 2 hours earlier on a wet road in Arlington. And if the precision of that echo was lost on Landers in his current state, it was not lost on Hoffman, who stood behind the booking desk and heard it and felt it land somewhere specific inside him. As Landers was walked across the squad room toward the holding cells at the back of the building, he passed within a few feet of where Ada was standing, and he looked at the floor the entire time, not out of humility, not out of remorse, but out of the specific shame of a man who has been exposed completely and cannot bear to see his own exposure reflected back in the eyes of the person he wronged. Ada watched him go, and her expression held nothing that could be described as satisfaction, because satisfaction was not what she felt. What she felt was the profound and complicated exhaustion of someone who has won a battle. She should never have had to fight in a war that has been going on her entire life, and that this single conviction, as correct and as necessary as it was, would not by itself end. Reyes stood in his corner of the room and watched Landers disappear through the door at the back, and he looked at the cup of water on the counter. Ada's cup still sitting there half empty, and he made a decision that he could not fully articulate yet, but that he could feel in the way you feel the moment when something you have been avoiding thinking about clearly becomes impossible to avoid any longer. The rain had stopped before dawn, leaving the streets of Arlington dark and wet and reflecting the early orange of streetlights in long, still pools across the asphalt and inside the Pentagon's executive facilities. General Ada Caldwell stood before a mirror in the officer's locker room and fastened the last button of her Class A dress uniform with the same steady hand she brought to everything, and then she looked at her wrists. The marks were visible, 2 bands of reddened, slightly swollen skin where the handcuffs had been ratcheted too tight, and she looked at them for a moment with the same quality of attention she had given them in the precinct, noting the color and the depth with the clinical detachment of someone who is documenting rather than dwelling. And then she pulled her sleeves down and straightened her jacket, not to hide the marks, but because the uniform required it, and she picked up her briefcase, returned to her by Colonel Webb's team with every seal intact, not a single classified page disturbed, and walked out of the locker room and down the corridor toward the briefing room. General Roland T., Graves was already seated when she arrived, a man of 61, with the contained physical presence of someone who has spent 4 decades making decisions in rooms where the wrong decision costs lives. And he looked at her across the polished mahogany table with an expression that contained both the professional assessment of a commanding officer evaluating one of his most senior people and something more personal than that, something that acknowledged without requiring discussion that what had happened last night was not a small thing, even if they were both about to behave as though the work came first. She briefed him on the South China Sea situation with full precision: carrier group positions, readiness assessments, diplomatic pressure points, and he listened with the focused attention he always brought to her briefings. And when she finished, he closed the folder and told her that the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division had taken over the prosecution from the Arlington District Attorney who had stepped aside the moment he reviewed the body camera footage, and that Landers was now facing federal felony charges in the Eastern District of Virginia that carried mandatory minimums the local system could not have imposed. Ada received this information the way she received all information, by processing it completely and then moving to what it meant for what needed to happen next. And when Graves asked her in the way that senior military leaders ask things that are not quite questions, whether there was anything she wanted from this beyond the prosecution, she was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was thinking rather than composing, and then she told him what she wanted, and it was not what he had expected. The federal courthouse in Alexandria was a building designed to communicate the weight and permanence of institutional authority, and on the morning that United States versus Brett Landers opened in Courtroom 7 before the Honorable Judge Eleanor Byrd. It was doing that job particularly well, the high ceilings and polished wood and gallery, packed with reporters and observers and people who had driven from different parts of the metropolitan area because they had followed this story and understood that what was being adjudicated here was larger than one man's behavior on one road on one rainy night in November. Landers sat at the defense table in a jacket that did not fit quite right, representing the fact that the Fraternal Order of Police had formally declined to provide legal assistance, a decision communicated to him by his former union representative in a meeting that lasted less than 4 minutes, and that ended with the representative telling him without particular sympathy that he had not merely violated a policy or mishandled a situation, but had placed federal classification materials at risk and assaulted a military officer of 4-star rank, and that the union's exposure in defending that was something their legal team had assessed and found catastrophic, and so he was on his own, and he was represented instead by a federal public defender named William Carver, who was thorough and competent and who had told Landers plainly in their first meeting that the evidence against him was comprehensive, and that his best option was a plea which Landers had refused. The federal prosecutor opened with a portrait that was not dramatic or embellished, but was in its factual accumulation utterly devastating. 11 years, 9 complaints, a union that had operated as a machinery of protection for a man who had used his badge as a private instrument of intimidation. And then one night in November, when that machinery met something it was not built to stop, and the entire architecture came apart. The 9 prior complainants were named one by one, and their experiences were summarized briefly but specifically, and each name and each summary landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Not a statistic, not a pattern, but a person with a name and a story, and a specific night when Brett Landers had decided they were a target rather than a citizen. Sergeant Hoffman sat in the witness box on the second day of trial and told the truth about what he had seen over the years he had worked alongside Landers, and it cost him something visible to do it, not because he was protecting Landers, whom he had long since stopped respecting, but because telling the full truth required him to account for his own role in the architecture of silence that had allowed this to continue for as long as it had, and he did that accounting in front of a full courtroom under oath. And when he finished and stepped down from the box, he looked like a man who has set down something very heavy and is not yet sure whether the relief is worth the pain. On the third day of trial, the gallery went quiet before Ada had cleared the rear doors of the courtroom in the way that spaces go quiet when someone enters who has a quality of presence that the room itself seems to register before the people in it consciously process what they're responding to. And she walked down the center aisle in full Class A dress uniform, 4 stars on her shoulders and 3 decades of service ribbons across her chest, and took the oath and settled into the witness box with her hands folded on the railing in front of her, and looked at the jury. She testified in the same voice she used for everything unhurried, precise, containing within its steadiness the clear message that she had nothing to perform and nothing to hide and nothing to fear from the truth. And she described each element of the stop with the specificity of someone who had committed every detail to memory from the moment it began. Not because she was angry, and not because she was seeking anything for herself, but because she had understood from the moment those handcuffs clicked that the most important thing she could do in that situation was to be an absolutely perfect witness. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brief and clearly reluctant. A man doing an obligation he had calculated he could not win, and when he suggested that the late hour and the stress of her demanding job might have led her tone to be perceived as combative. Ada looked at him with an expression that was not unkind, but that contained within it the full weight of 30 years of knowing exactly what she was doing in high-pressure situations, and she told him that she was intimately familiar with stress, and that at no point in her interaction with his client had she lost her composure, raised her voice, or behaved in any way that a reasonable professional could have interpreted as threatening, and that she recognized immediately that she was dealing with an armed and irrational individual, and that her only objective had been de-escalation and survival. And she said the word survival with a weight that made several jurors look down at their notes. In the gallery, seated in the row near the aisle with her mother's hand wrapped around hers, was a girl of 11 named Amani Washington, the daughter of Derek Washington, one of the 9 names that had been read aloud from Landers's complaint history, a man who had been pulled from his vehicle on a summer night 3 years ago, and whose complaint had been filed and buried and never resolved, and Amani had come to this courthouse today because her mother had told her that something important was happening here, something she should see, and she was watching Ada in the witness box with the quality of attention that children bring to things they understand, without being able to articulate why are going to matter for the rest of their lives. Ada sat in that box with her hands folded and her back straight, and spoke the truth in a voice that did not waver, and Amani watched her, and something shifted in the girl's understanding of what was possible in a room like this, who got to sit where, who got to speak and be believed, and what a person looked like when they had not been broken by any of the things that were supposed to break them. The jury deliberated for 91 minutes, which in the context of a federal criminal trial with the volume of evidence that had been presented was an almost perfunctory amount of time, and when the 4-person stood to read the verdicts, the courtroom was so quiet that the sound of a reporter shifting in the press gallery carried all the way to the front of the room. Deprivation of rights under color of law, guilty. Aggravated assault, guilty. Reckless endangerment of classified national defense materials, guilty. Each word landing with the flat definitive finality of something that cannot be unmade, and each time the word was spoken, Landers seemed to contract slightly as though the verdicts were something physical rather than legal, as though each one removed another layer of something he had spent 11 years building between himself and accountability. He wept not with remorse exactly, but with the desperate, disbelieving grief of a man who has operated for so long within a structure that protected him that he had come to believe the protection was permanent, and its removal was not just terrifying but genuinely incomprehensible to him, like a law of physics that had suddenly been repealed. 2 weeks later, Judge Eleanor Byrd looked down from the bench at Brett Landers with an expression that contained neither cruelty nor sympathy, but something colder and more final than either the expression of a person who has read every document in a case file and arrived at a clear and complete understanding of what she is looking at, and she sentenced him to 96 months in federal prison to be served without possibility of early parole with permanent revocation of his right to bear arms and his eligibility for any position of public trust. And she told him in measured sentences that would be quoted in law journals and journalism programs for years afterward that he had treated the badge he was given as a license to harm rather than a responsibility to protect, and that the court's sentence was not an act of vengeance but a statement of what the law means when it is applied without exception. The U.S. Marshals stepped forward, and Landers stood on unsteady legs, and as they guided him toward the side door, he turned his head once toward the gallery, and his eyes found Ada, who was seated near the aisle in her civilian charcoal suit. The same suit she had been wearing the night he arrested her, and she looked back at him with the steady, clear gaze of someone who has already moved past this moment in their thinking and is simply completing the last obligation of bearing witness. And he looked away first, and the door closed behind him. In the second row, Imani Washington watched the door close, and she felt her mother's hand tighten around hers, and she thought about the woman she had watched in the witness box, the stillness of her hands, the even weight of her voice, the way she had sat in that chair like someone who was unbreakable, not because nothing had tried to break her, but because she had decided somewhere along the way that it was not allowed to. Sergeant Hoffman was seated in the gallery's far left section, and he had come alone, and he had not been required to come at all, and when the verdict was read, he sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes forward, and felt 22 years of looking away from things he had understood and chosen not to address settle onto him with a weight that he suspected correctly he would be managing for the rest of his life. And after the room began to empty, he sat there for a little while longer by himself before standing up and walking out into the cold afternoon. The Department of Justice consent decree that was imposed on the Arlington County Police Department in the weeks following the verdict required comprehensive changes to use of force policy, mandatory bias training, external oversight of civilian complaints, and an independent audit of every arrest made by Brett Landers during his 11 years on the force. And the audit produced results that took 4 months to process, and that resulted in the review of 31 cases, the expungement of 7 wrongful convictions and financial settlements, with 11 individuals and families whose encounters with Landers had been documented in complaints that the department had buried rather than investigated. Darnell Reyes submitted an unsolicited internal report 2 weeks after the verdict, a document that nobody had asked him to write, and that he had spent 6 evenings composing at his kitchen table, going through it carefully, making sure that every sentence was accurate and that nothing in it was softened by the instinct toward self-protection that he recognized in himself, and that he had decided during those 6 evenings to override. And in it he described what he had seen on the night of Ada's arrest, what he had known, what he had done, and what he had not done, and why the cup of water had been the first honest act he had committed since putting on the uniform. Dale Hoffman read Reyes's report before it was formally submitted, and then he wrote one of his own longer and harder, covering not just that night, but 22 years of accumulated small choices to look away from things he had understood and not acted on. And he submitted it along with his resignation effective at the end of the month. And before he cleared his desk, he drove to 3 separate addresses in Arlington County and knocked on 3 separate front doors and stood on 3 separate front porches and said without preparation or performance that he was sorry for what had happened, and that he had known more than he had done anything about, and that he understood, if that apology did not count for much, but that he needed to make it anyway. Reyes did not leave the department, and he did not pretend that staying was easy, or that everything about the institution had changed overnight, because it had not. And he knew it had not. And he had decided that knowing that was exactly the reason to stay, rather than the reason to go. Because change in a place like that does not come from outside pressure alone, but from the people inside who decide one shift at a time that they are going to do the job differently than it has been done before. He was the first officer in the Arlington County Police Department to complete the full certification in the new implicit bias training program, which had been developed in consultation with the Department of Defense, and which carried in its opening materials language that he recognized had been shaped by someone who understood from the inside exactly what it felt like to be a person navigating the world without the protections that most people in institutional authority had never had to think about, because they had always had them. He printed his completion certificate and folded it and put it in his jacket pocket on his next shift, not because he needed anyone to see it, but because he wanted to be the person who had it. Ada had been invited to appear on 3 national news programs in the weeks following the verdict, and she had declined all of them, not because she was unaware of the value of the platform, but because she had spent a great deal of time thinking about what she actually wanted this to produce, and she had concluded that another conversation about what had been done to her was not the thing that was going to change anything for the people who couldn't afford to decline the invitation to be victimized by it in the first place. What she wanted, and what she told General Graves she wanted in the meeting that followed the verdict, and what she had told him she wanted in that 5 o'clock briefing on the morning after her arrest, when he had asked her the question she had expected, was something structural. Something that would outlast the news cycle and the outrage and the moment when people moved on to the next thing, and she had the credibility and the institutional relationships to build it, and she intended to use them. The joint task force she proposed between the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice took 4 months to formally establish and another 6 months to produce its first results, and she chaired the working group personally, attending each meeting in her civilian suite rather than her uniform, because she wanted the people in the room local and state law enforcement officers, trainers, policy analysts, legal experts to engage with the substance of what was being built rather than the rank of the person building it. The program that emerged was not a mandatory sensitivity seminar of the kind that gets scheduled and resented and forgotten, but a comprehensive credit-bearing professional development certification that required officers to engage genuinely with the ways in which unexamined assumptions produce dangerous outcomes built on real case studies and real data and real testimony from real people whose encounters with law enforcement had gone wrong in ways that were preventable, and that had not before now been treated as the institutional failures they were. Ada presented the program's framework at a law enforcement leadership conference in 3 cities, wearing each time the same charcoal civilian suit, and she did not tell her story as a victim's narrative, but as a case study in what happens when institutional structures fail to hold individuals accountable over time, and what it takes to build something that actually stops that failure from compounding across decades. Reyes became the first Arlington County officer to complete the full certification, and then he stayed to help facilitate the next cohort, and then he applied to become a certified trainer and Holloway's successor. A woman named Chief Sandra Okafor, who had been brought in specifically to rebuild what the consent decree had dismantled, approved the application and gave him the resources he needed, and Reyes ran the first official training session on a Tuesday morning in March, in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the precinct, where he had set a cup of water on a counter in front of a woman in handcuffs, and done in that moment the first right thing he had done since joining the force. 3 years and 4 months after the night in the gas station parking lot, a 14-year-old girl named Imani Washington sat at the desk in her bedroom with a blank document open on her laptop screen and a school assignment at the top of the page that read, "Write about the person who has most shaped how you see the world and what is possible in it." She had been thinking about the assignment for 3 days before she sat down to write it, turning it over in her mind in the way she turned over anything that mattered to her carefully from multiple angles, making sure she understood what she actually thought before she committed to saying it. And she had considered several people, including her mother and her grandmother and a teacher who had told her in the 6th grade that her mind was precise in a way that would take her somewhere significant if she chose to let it. But when she actually sat down and put her hands on the keyboard, what came was not any of those people. What came was a memory of sitting in a federal courthouse on a gray afternoon with her mother's hand around hers, watching a woman in a military uniform walk down the center aisle with 4 silver stars on her shoulders. And what Imani had felt in that moment was not simply admiration, but something more specific and more personal than that. a sudden physical understanding that the category of person who got to sit in the powerful seat in that room, who got to speak and be heard and be believed, was not fixed, was not someone else's category, was something she could also occupy. She wrote about the stillness of Ada's hands on the witness box railing, not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of someone who had decided somewhere far back along a long and difficult road that she was not going to be moved by any of the things that had tried to move her, that she was going to stand exactly where she stood and say exactly what was true, and let the truth do its own work. She wrote about what it meant to watch someone be entirely unbroken, and she wrote about how that was different from watching someone pretend to be unbroken. And she wrote about how she could tell the difference even at 11 years old, sitting in a wooden gallery chair while her mother squeezed her hand. And she wrote at the end of the essay in a sentence that her teacher would later read aloud to the class, and that would sit in the air of the room afterward in the particular way that certain sentences do not celebrated loudly, but received quietly, the way something that has been recognized, rather than discovered, gets received. She didn't need anyone in that room to know her name. She already knew it herself. And when I grow up, that is the only kind of power I want. Brett Landers reported to FCY Petersburg on a gray Tuesday morning in January, and was processed into the general population of a mid-security federal correctional facility where nobody knew his name and nobody cared about his badge, and the 11 years of institutional protection that had functioned as the architecture of his identity was simply absent, the way a building is absent when it has been demolished, leaving only the footprint of the foundation where it used to stand. And he would serve every one of his 96 months there, without early release, without the union, without the blue wall that had shielded his worst impulses from consequence. For more than a decade, a man who had believed himself untouchable, discovering with the slow thoroughness of a very long sentence exactly how wrong that belief had always been. The training program that Ada built was adopted by 43 law enforcement agencies across 11 states within 18 months of its launch, and the data from the first year of implementation showed a measurable reduction in civilian complaint escalations in every department that had completed the full certification, not because the program had fixed every officer or resolved every bias or solved a problem that had been building for generations, but because it had established for the first time in those departments the institutional expectation that officers would be held accountable to a standard of conduct that did not have exceptions for people who had always been protected from the consequences of falling below it. And Darnell Reyes ran his 14th training cohort on a Thursday in April, standing at the front of the room in his Arlington County uniform. And at the end of the session, a young officer in the back row asked him why he had stayed in the department after everything that happened, and Reyes thought about it for a moment, really thought about it the way the question deserved. And then he said that he had stayed because leaving was easier than changing, and he had decided he was done choosing easy. In a classroom in Arlington on a Friday afternoon in late spring, Imani Washington stood at the front of the room and read her essay aloud, and when she got to the last line, the room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something true has been said in exactly the right words, and her teacher did not speak for a moment, and neither did anyone else. And Imani stood there in that silence and felt it not as emptiness, but as the specific fullness of a room full of people who have just received something and are holding it carefully before they decide what to do with it. And she folded her paper and walked back to her seat, and somewhere across the city, in a building full of satellite imagery and classified briefing folders and the constant low hum of the machinery of global strategy, a 4-star general sat at a polished mahogany table and did the work she had always done and would always do, and she was exactly where she had always known she was supposed to be. If this story of real justice and unbreakable dignity stayed with you, if watching General Caldwell turn one of the worst nights of her life into a shield for everyone who came after her, moved something in you, please hit the like button right now, because it tells the algorithm that stories about real accountability and real courage deserve to be seen by more people. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that power without integrity always collapses under the weight of its own arrogance. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss the stories we bring you, stories about the people who stood still when everything tried to move them and changed the world by refusing to budge.